Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Gilda Hilaire, and I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager leading Marketing Cloud Trailblazer programs. Today, we're going to have a live discussion on server-side JavaScript featuring Greg Gifford and Jacob Edwards from DEG, moderated by Karina Cohan from Caleres. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If anyone has any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. We will try to address these during the presentation and at the end. Now, without further ado, because I know all of you are waiting for this live interactive discussion, we will turn the time over to Karina, who will be moderating the session. Karina, take it over.
Good morning, everyone. So we'll go ahead and get started with the basics. And our first question is, I'm new to SSJS and I need a kickstart. Where should I go?
I'll start on that. I'm going to start with my shameless self-promotion of my blog that I've been writing, goretonington.com. I've been starting a whole series of articles about this, about what Marketing Cloud server-side JavaScript is and different uses for it, and some myths and fallacies that go along with it. Like, there's a lot of talk about how server-side JavaScript is much less performant than Amp Script and things along those lines that I've helped clarify. Not saying it's 100% wrong, but it's not something that is as accurate as it being best practice to always use AMP script. Other than that, there are the official documents on Marketing Cloud that they're not great, but there is a lot of information in there. It's just usually you have to kind of dig around to try and find what you're looking for in order to use it. Then there's Stack Exchange is always great. Like, it's something that I've leaned on quite a few times where I run into a specific issue and I have to run on there and go, hey, this thing is just not working. What's going on? And there's tons of smart people on there to be able to help you figure it out. There's also the Email Geeks channels where there's a vendor channel, then I think there's a private SFMC Geeks channel that you can look at to get help. Again, there's a ton of smart people in there that'll give you the interaction that you might not get in Stack Exchange. Other than that, I think there's success communities and different group communities like that. Then, of course, there's always How to SFMC, which I'm one of the admins along with Karina on. And Jacob, did I miss anything?
Yeah, I would just add that if you're looking for specific things like a function syntax or even just a certain phrase that you think would be helpful in your project, something that you're looking to learn more about, advanced Google search operators are very helpful, and it's what I use all the time looking through documentation. You can set the site to be only the Salesforce docs, or let it go and you get the great blogs that Greg was mentioning and some others as well. But that's helpful because sometimes the information is kind of buried in the documentation, and just going directly there using Google it makes it easier.
Sorry, I actually had one more thing to add too. I completely forgot about this, but me and quite a few other smart people are working on trying to build a server-side JavaScript guide similar to what Adam and Elliot created for AMP script. We're going to try and make that a more living community document. So it might not be as defined as what you see there, but it will constantly be updated with all of the changes by the community. So it'll be more open than what they currently have. But that's down the road. That's nothing right now that we have. But yeah, hopefully within the next year, you should see something.
And we'll share some of these links in our follow-up email after the webinar as well, for those of you asking for the URL. And then it's also been posted in the questions and response. So I think you can grab it out of there as well. So our next question is, what are some best practices to follow to have better performance?
Well, for better performance, I would say just reduce unnecessary code. abstract your code out into functions. Sometimes if it's, because the code will operate from top down, like when you're just using a regular script. And so if you build out all of your different, possible paths that you could go down with like your if and then statements and all that, then it can be very difficult to debug, first of all. I find it better to abstract your code out into functions and then just run those functions. As far as performance, overall, I would say that would, it allows only the code that is necessary to run instead of going through all of your if statements and only, executing the code that is that meets the conditions to run that way. So, that's one way. There are a lot of different ways and it depends on the project that you're doing as well. Greg, do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I agree. It's really tough to give best practices on it because it's used in so many ways. I can give some general stuff around, like, I would not mix server-side JavaScript and AMP script unless it's absolutely necessary, because having the two languages in there adds extra processing and translation that, in order to make it correctly interact, that will slow it down. I would say inside the messaging environments, including email, I wouldn't use core functions. I know some of them won't even work inside of there, but again, the added processing by adding core in will slow down the email. I would say if you need to use like a JSON or an array of some sort, obviously you should lean towards JavaScript. Because of all of the features of JavaScript, I would say if you need to use anything with API, it's the way to go. I mean, you got WS proxy, you got functions to be able to repeatedly build API calls. It's much more versatile and I think set up to handle that kind of interaction than the AMP script is. Other than that, I would say if you're working in a messaging environment using server-side JavaScript, try to keep it as simple as possible, because a lot of the processing you see where it slows things down is because you've written crazily complex server-side JavaScript to fit a need, and that's what's slowing it down.
Yeah, and also just to add, I know that we have some script activities where they take longer than a half hour to run. So, it's maybe not to improve runtime performance, but just overall, your automation performance. We've added, 25-minute timeout periods, and then it'll go to the next script activity and pick up where it left off. So that would just be, performance in the sense that your automation wouldn't fail in that case.
Yeah, and to jump on that again, shameless self-promotion, on my blog, I have a basic sample of how to do that as well that you can look up and, begin with as a template.
So what are some beginner and intermediate level use cases for people that are new to using JavaScript?
I would say use cases a lot is on web pages and script activities. Jacob, do you want to jump in real quick? I don't know why
Sure.
I'm having a lot of trouble thinking right now.
Well, I would say
I can only think of the web pages I've used too. I'm trying to think of a script activity.
Yeah, if you're familiar with like HTML forms and things like that, then I would have to evaluate whether to use AMP script or server-side JavaScript for a simple like landing page or preference center or something like that. But I would say like parsing JSON, if you understand the structure of a JSON object, then using server-side JavaScript to parse out those keys and value pairs, I would say that's something that is on the more beginner side. And then, but also for the HTML forms and whatnot, you could use AMP script for this, but you can get your query parameters on form submit, do all of your environments like get or post, runtime execution and all that. So I would say those are some of the, at least those are some of the first times that I used server-side JavaScript.
Yeah, I've had time to think now, so I'm caught up. But I think probably one of the major use cases for both beginner and intermediate is WS Proxy. Like it's a very powerful tool to be able to interact with the Marketing Cloud APIs without needing to really leave the context of JavaScript. Like you're able to do interaction with subscribers with data extensions. You can build queries or retrieve queries or a ton of other things that make it easier than trying to do it through AMP script interactions through lookups or through upserts or things like that, or even the platform versions of it. I mean, I would say probably WS Proxy is king of script activities. I'd say a good 7 or 8 out of 10 script activities have WS Proxy in there in some way. But yeah, I mean, like you could even use it to like auto generate data extensions, or have it where it'll build out your second automation, or it could make dynamic SQL queries, or there's a ton of things like that really that's why I think WS Proxy would probably be the best use case for server-side JavaScript. Outside of that, I would say a lot of the core functions are probably the best utilization of it on a script activity mostly. I would kind of shy more towards the APIs on a landing page, just because they're usually working larger bulk things, and WS Proxy is designed for a lot of that than the web page. Yeah, I'm just about.
On the same note, can you give some examples of when it would be better to use SSJS over AMP script?
Well, I mean, feel like I've said this in every answer, but
Yep.
The APIs, like it's by and far my favorite to work in, because there's 2 functions inside of AMP script to really connect to the APIs outside of the built-in, which, as anyone that's worked in the built-in API functions in AMP script knows, it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. Like in order to do something you could do in 2 lines inside of REST or inside of even just WS Proxy, it takes about 20 lines to set it up inside of that, and it's very, very slow. So, I mean, just building a function using like this script.util HTTP requests or WS Proxy, or using the gets and stuff inside of JavaScript, I feel like it's better not just inside of the efficiency, but it's also better inside of handling the return. It's better in setting it up, because it uses arrays and it uses JSON abilities that AMP script can only dream of.
Yeah, I would add as well some script activities. Technically, you can't use AMP script in a script activity, but you can get around that by putting your AMP script in a content block and then calling that content block with your server-side JavaScript. But specifically, I would use server-side JavaScript for like pulling from an external API and saving, image URLs or whatever data I'm getting in a data extension. I'd probably do that in server-side JavaScript, especially if if it's being returned as a JSON object, because AMP script it's difficult to parse through JSON with AMP script, almost impossible, at least in a dynamic way. And yeah, so I mean also some Salesforce like CRM interactions as well. Like AMP script has the create and update and delete Salesforce objects, but I found that server-side JavaScript handles some of the other items like pick lists and whatnot, where, because in AMP script you can't use arrays like right out of the box. There are ways around that, like row sets and delimited strings and whatnot, but they're not truly arrays, whereas JavaScript, server-side JavaScript does have that. So it really comes down to just some of the core differences between the 2 languages.
Yeah, sorry, I'm going to jump back in real quick too. Jacob reminded me with the JSON parsing. There are also, with AMP script, like he said, the Salesforce functions are really, there's nothing in server-side JavaScript to match that currently. I know that there is movement to try and correct that. I don't know how far it's going to get or how quickly. But really, a lot of the everyday tasks that you would do inside of an email, AMP Script is probably the way to go. But the more complex you get, that's when it starts leading towards you should work on server-side JavaScript with, the thought of processing time and all of that. Keep that in consideration. But the other thing that I really think is a huge impact between choosing a language is loops. AMP Script only has a for loop. Server-side JavaScript has while, do while, for. It's got many more options, and it also has a try catch that AMP Script cannot match, and that's huge on debugging.
Oh, excuse me. To answer a couple of questions that have come in over the chat, we are going to be sharing this recording afterwards. And then a few of you have asked if the REST proxy is going to be on the roadmap. Salesforce is aware of everyone's requests, but I don't know when it will be coming out. But they have heard us, and so it's not falling on deaf ears. So fingers crossed, sometime in the near future, we will have that.
That's amazing.
But I did want to answer that one for you real quick. So let's see, what's the most cohesive online SSJS library?
There really isn't one. Like that's probably one of the major issues that people have with this, and where a lot of the misinformation comes from, is that like the best resource is right now the online official documentation, which, as I mentioned earlier, it's got a lot of great information in it. It's just trying to find it. Like there's a ton of awesome context stuff you can do on the script blocks that, unless you sit there and read through this long list of things, you'll never see, because it's just listed in there in the middle of a paragraph. So like there's a ton of awesome things like that isn't organized in the right way. But I mean, other than that, it's just blog articles, Stack Exchange, piece here, piece there. Google's your friend.
And as far as like code libraries, like jQuery or something like that, like for vanilla JavaScript, I'm not aware of any specifically for server-side JavaScript that you can like add to extend it, other than like just using the the platform functions and maybe importing like 1.1.5, but I'm not even sure if that actually would have any difference in that regard. I know we've talked about in the past, like building our own kind of library, but that kind of falls into what we were talking about earlier with like importing with an HTTP GET and like just referencing functions that you've written in the past. So it's not exactly like a JavaScript library, but kind of.
Yeah, to bring that too. Yeah, I've been toying around with that forever. I love the idea of being able to just have a list of functions, so that all you have to do in writing your JavaScript is 20 lines of functions, and it's done. You don't have to sit there, copy paste things across, or recreate the wheel or anything like that. The issue that I usually come into is that in order to get that, you have to store it in a content block or externally, like Jacob was saying, and the processing to grab that in and translate that back into actually content that is then rendered, and it has to be inside of its own block above all the rest of your code. Like, by the point all that's done, it probably would have been quicker and more efficient just to have copy and pasted it in directly.
All right, so our next question is, what tools do you use to develop your JavaScript?
I usually use Sublime Text. It's got the highlighter. It's great for syntax. There's even, I think, a JSON plugin that you can use to format JSONs and check and validate it and things like that. And I just from there keep that local and then push it into Marketing Cloud to check and make sure that the Marketing Cloud aspects of it are correct.
So
Yeah.
in addition to the, oh, sorry, Jacob.
Oh no,
forgot to let you
I was just
answer.
going to agree. And
Okay.
there are a lot of packages in Sublime. And also just one nice thing about Sublime is there's the AMP script highlighting as well. So if you're using like a mix between server-side JavaScript and AMP script, it will highlight it'll do the syntax highlighting for both languages, JavaScript and AMP scripts and HTML, all in the same document.
Yep. Great. Yeah, I forgot about the AMP script syntax highlighting that you can do in Sublime. All right, so let's see, the next one. Are there any CPU time, real-time heap size limits when executing SSJS on both landing pages and script activities, besides the 30 minutes limitation for the script activity?
I mean, that's, yeah, like that's absolutely true. Yeah, with landing pages, there's absolutely the browser is a huge impact there, as well as the 30-minute with the script activity. Outside of that, like a lot of that is all internally on Salesforce. We don't have exposure to it. We've done our own tests. We've tried to see things, and honestly, the results that I've seen, it's so variable that like I can't place what the actual limits are. Like it's a general guideline of, like the simpler the better is really the best I got for you in response to that. Like it also depends on the current stack. Like if the stack is overwhelmed or overworked, your stuff is going to run so much slower. So like it's hard to give any guidelines without having the information on the server and being able to actually connect and work, quote unquote, on the back end of it to see the limitations there, which I doubt as a community we will ever ever see. Whether or not Salesforce releases that information, I don't know.
Yeah, usually when I'm working out a script, I'll do it in Cloud Pages first, like with some write functions to just output what's going on in my code. But then if I'm getting to a point where it's taking a really long time and I'm, doing more processing and the browser starts to just, take a really long time to load, then that's when I'll usually like turn off my like debug mode, and that will turn off all the write functions, and then I'll move it into a script activity, because you can't use those write functions in in a script activity, and so point being though, like if you are developing in the browser, like on a cloud page, if it's something that has a lot of processing, eventually you're going to need to move into a script activity to have that half-hour timeout instead of just the browser like page load time.
Do you have any other tips for debugging while we're on the topic?
I'd say it comes down to the style that you write your code in. That's kind of number one for Marketing Cloud, and I would say the same for AMP script as well. But for server-side JavaScript, if you it's kind of what I said before. If you have a bunch of if statements and it's like a decision tree of like where you're ending up in the processing page with all your code, then that can be difficult to debug. But if it's all kind of abstracted out into functions and you have it where it'll even do write functions, or like that would be on a cloud page, or if it was in a script activity and you were logging to a data extension, that's it really does depend on the project. Like I recently did one that was a subscriber delete project where I would log the subscriber key and the status of the API call that I used. So it would either be okay or error. And so then when the script activity would run, I could go in there and see what happened at least. So there are a couple different types of debugging in that. That one's more like error logging, but debugging, I would say use the write functions like in a cloud page. Correct?
Yeah. So Tony, and I'm not even going to attempt to say his last name. I've messed it up every single time, but Tony Zups, we'll go with, as he's known inside of a lot of the email geeks, wrote an article on how to SFMC about debugging. So I would definitely recommend going there and taking a look as well. But yeah, to jump on with Jacob, it's a lot of try catch. I usually use that. the one thing to pay attention to with try catch is that it's a function. So any variables you set inside of it are local. So once the try is done, all those variables will not be retained. So if you try catch a WS proxy call and you get the result, and then outside of the catch block you try to call it, it's going to return null because it doesn't exist globally. But yeah, a lot of write. You can also do inserts into data extensions. So like if you're trying to grab context on status of different things, so say you have to move the script activity because of the length of the load, you can then insert those into the data extension to show this record, this passed, this passed, this passed, or even into a content block or something. You can write information inside of there and upload it as it goes. Yeah, that's usually, but I mean, again, like I guess like Jacob was saying, that kind of falls into error logging a little bit as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say the main thing is try catch for actual debugging.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's see. Oh, I just lost the question I was going to ask. Let's see here. Let's go into some kind of more specific ones. What are some of the more frequently used functions by you two? Or what are some of your, I guess, favorite? People want to know what you use the most.
My favorite by far, and I'm sure anyone that has any sort of interaction with me knows the answer to this. It's the script.util functions, the content syndication ones. They are by far my favorite thing to play with because it gives you pretty much full range with interacting with any API calls. It gives you any method that you would want. It gives you the ability to change the headers passed in, including retries, including error handling, null results, all of that. Whereas if anything that's not a 200 that's passed back instead of most of the other calls will result in the function tossing an error, in the sense of it'll toss the 500 error that you get. This will just return the call and say, hey, this was the response was 401 or whatever issue there was, and then you can then gracefully handle that error and correctly account for it.
Yeah. I would say get post data, parse JSON. Those are needed to actually utilize the JSON parsing capabilities in server-side JavaScript, and so I mean that like combined with like what Greg was saying, or even just like an HTTP GET, that can be very powerful in Marketing Cloud. Like just like I was saying earlier, pulling from external APIs. In a script activity and filling in data extensions, and then using that data that you filled in your emails, later on. It's very powerful, and using the JSON parsing functions is that allows us to do that.
Yeah, and to jump on that again too, I know I keep doing little bits here and there, but the response and the request objects under it and platform are amazing because you can set and remove, retrieve cookies and retrieve the headers from the request and all of that kind of stuff that allows you interaction with the browser that is just, it's fun.
And even something like get form field, that's just one that's easy to use and very useful for preference centers or landing pages, stuff like that, any forms.
All right.
There's too many.
Yeah.
So let's see. I'm not quite sure how to ask this. I'm going to attempt to ask this one. They want to know your favorite SSJS scripts that SQL can't do.
Well, I think the answer to that, at least in my opinion, is that it's not that there's something that SQL can't do. I think it would be more because in general, if you're touching data, doing something that SQL would touch, use SQL. Like it's much more performant. It's got much less translations to actually interact with the data than server-side JavaScript does. So you'll be able to do a lot more with it. But if you use server-side JavaScript, you can create almost variables inside of that SQL and be able to use it more like actual SQL instead of SQL queries. So you'd be able to have it where you run the same SQL query multiple times with multiple different targets, with multiple different values inside of it, and it allows you to more efficiently and effectively use SQL to get what you want.
Yeah. Yeah, and with server-side JavaScript, you do have that row limit, which would you need to account for that, whereas SQL can handle millions of rows of data. Recently, I wrote a script. Well, actually, I took a script from Stack Exchange, Elliot Harper, and changed it a bit. It was parsing XML with server-side JavaScript, and I thought I was going to use it, instead of SQL. I was having some issues with this specific XML, but I ended up not because of that row limit issue and just performance and everything. I just went back to SQL and figured out what I had to do with parsing that. So it like let my programmatic mind wander a little bit, but then when it came back to reality and it was bound by the limitations of Automation Studio, that's when it's like, okay, I should just use SQL.
Yeah, I did think of one other use case that actually probably would fit better, is removing rows from a data extension. That really is probably the only thing that server-side JavaScript is able to do better than SQL, because SQL doesn't have, at least in the query in Marketing Cloud, doesn't have the delete option. You have to do add, update add, or overwrite, and doing an overwrite may not be the solution you want. In order to remove those records, you want to keep everything the same. So you then have to go through that whole dance of creating a second staging data extension to then push that data in, and then have that data then overwrite the other one. And it's a bit more difficult when all you want to do is remove these 10 records and you don't want to go into the UI to do it.
That's a great point.
Is there an option to use SSJS asynchronously?
As a whole, no. It's an old old version of JavaScript. I don't even know if asynchronous was a light in the eye of the creator when they did this. It's all based off of the C# interpreter for JavaScript. So like it's even at that level, like it's still controlled because it's all existing on a different server. So I mean, like if you're looking at like API calls, yes, there are asynchronous options, but in general, like loading and utilizing it's all synchronous.
Yeah, I've seen it where we have like a forum page that has a drop down where you can choose like, a country. If you chose US, then there'd be an API call that would go to a processing page, and the server-side JavaScript would return values from data extensions for like all the countries. So if you chose like Canada, then it would give you all the provinces, and so that was asynchronous in the sense that the page was changing, like the form elements were changing without the page being reloaded, and it was being driven by the conversation between that page and the server-side JavaScript processing page. But since it runs on the server, I mean, it's mostly as far as I understand it, at least, it would be mostly the client side JavaScript that would really be running asynchronously.
Yeah, good old Ajax. Love it. Very, very much miss it in server side.
All right, I'm going to get into some of the more specific questions here for the last 20 minutes. All right, so our first one is, I've been using platform.request.getPostData to obtain posted data to the page, but I couldn't use it with binary data. Do you know if it's possible to do this?
I honestly have not tried that. I'm assuming binary data, you're talking about like pulling back images and things like that directly. I mean, I could say that maybe it's possible. It would all really depend on like the decoding of it and being able to grab it and correctly format it. I'm assuming probably into base 64, but it would probably all be a manual build, and it would all be trial and error. And I'm not sure that it's even possible, but in theory, maybe.
Yeah, I'm curious what the use case for that is, but to be honest, I don't know.
Is it possible to create a shared data extension using SSJS?
Do you
Greg,
want
do
to
you take
answer
that?
that? Oh, okay.
Okay, yeah.
Either way,
This has been a thing, so. Yeah.
We've had this discussion multiple times.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. You can explain
Okay,
that.
so answer to this is kind of. If you're talking about the core functions to build data extensions that way, no. Those are only for a local. If you're talking about using like WS proxy or the API through server-side JavaScript, it's still kind of. The reason being is that you can create the data extension and you can select the shared folder as the category ID, and it'll complete 100% like a normal. But if you go into the UI and try to find it, it's not there. You can scour the entire thing, and that just doesn't exist according to your context. The reason being is that behind the scenes, there's certain permissions that are given to users on shared that is required for them to be able to see it. And when you build it through WS proxy or the API, those aren't added. To get around it, what I would recommend is instead of building it and pushing it directly into that shared, if you build it into local and then move that into the shared, it'll actually work. So like rather than try and sit and try and figure out what those permissions are and how to add them inside the initial call, you just change it to 2 calls and it functions.
Is it possible to update the status of a account user function in SSJS?
So yes, but I've run into a ton of times where permissions have come back saying that you don't have the ability to do it when using those core functions. But there is the .activate and the .deactivate that are available that should work. But I've in the last 3 times I've tried to use it, it's come back. User 0 does not have permission to utilize this. And I have no idea why. Like it's worked before for me, but lately it keeps coming back with that issue. I'm assuming it's an internal thing where they have a default user associated with Cloud Pages and script activities that this permission isn't assigned to now for some reason.
Right. So using SSJS, how do you handle API calls that have rate limits, and how do you monitor to make sure you're not hitting that limit?
I would say the sleep function, that you've written, Greg, excuse me. That would be one way to, be able to kind of limit your own rate. But if you can get that value returned from the API, and then conditionally check against it, just write that code to make sure that you're under that rate limit. I have done that in the past, so that's one option. Greg, can you think of any others?
Yeah, like it's really, it's one of those things that it's so custom that it's hard to really give a definitive best practice approach to it. Like it really, using the sleep, using a for loop with limitations, or a while loop to make sure that it doesn't go past X number, like things like that, and being able to also ingest the response, because sometimes if you have a limit of 2,500, the last response will come back as you've reached the maximum limit, and then you pause it there, or tons of things like that. It's really what your system limitations are and what they provide back, and all of that to really what functions or what capabilities we'd recommend. I know it's a cop-out answer, and I apologize, but that's really the best I can give off of that.
Yeah, if you're able to get that, the limit back, like if it gives you, how many calls left you have, like in a certain time period or something, then I would, parse that out and then use that in your, in possibly a loop, but just conditionally, check that before making the next API call. But again, that would depend on your situation. If that's, if you're making, like if it's in a loop or whatever.
Can you use reCAPTCHA with SSJS?
So, short answer is yes, and really the best way to see this done is Ivan from ampscript.xyz wrote an awesome article about it. And rather than me butcher the awesome work he did, I would recommend you go and read that, and it'll give you a step-by-step how to utilize it.
How would you recommend filling data extensions using SSJS on an automation?
So I guess that really would depend on how much data you're pushing in. If you're looking at doing a one-to-one on one record per run, then probably looking at the core function. If you're looking at bulk, then I would look at WS proxy. Because with WS proxy, you can do batches, so you can retrieve 2,500 records, and then at the end, once you're done with manipulating that data, you can then do an update or insert for that 2,500 records and limit the amount of calls you have to do and limit the processing and make it more efficient that way. And then through continue request, you can just loop through and go through each one of the records. REST API is an option as well, but I mean that depends again on what you're doing. I would say WS proxy would be more efficient for if it's in the same business unit. If it's trying to transfer things from one business unit to another, then REST may be your option, but because you have to grab the auth token and all of that, it could be lower processing and require a bit more handling on timing. But in general, I would also probably not look at the platform data extension functions. They are an option, but in comparison to their capabilities to the core stuff, the core is much quicker.
Any tips for retrieving all of the sent event records for a single subscriber using WS proxy?
I know that can be difficult, especially in a cloud page setting. I think you'd have more luck doing that in a script activity just because of the processing required to do that. I know that someone on our team had tried that in the past, and it was timing out like big time. I mean, if you just wanted to see the sent events, then you could actually see the email history in the all context section of Contact Builder, but that doesn't really answer the question. I would say do it slowly in as many steps as possible, because it will time out if you try to just pull the entire all send events for subscriber key or anything like that. So sometimes, although it's kind of counterintuitive, sometimes it's helpful to have like a lot of different script activities that just do one or two things and just kind of takes it in chunks and to complete the entire job.
Yeah, and there is the filters on WS proxy. So if you're doing it with just a single person each time, then you can just filter by a subscriber key or something like that. I mean, honestly, I feel like this might be a better, again, use case for using SQL instead of WS proxy, just because it's sorry for my dogs. The mailman probably is walking outside. But yeah, it would be much more performant to grab all of that information based off of a SQL query than through WS proxy. I believe Susanna and sfmarketing.cloud has a good article about using WS proxy to hit those events too. If you want to use that for a reference, if push comes to shove and you need to do it through WS proxy.
So is there a way to set the response status using SSJS?
The status, no. That is, I believe, automatically generated. You can change headers. You can add cookies and things like that to it for you to be able to reference and use that instead of status as a reference in whatever retrieve or response that you want. But yeah, the actual status itself, I believe, is at least on our end as a user read only.
Can SSJS create a dummy data and a data extension for testing?
Oh my God, yes. Ivan, again, ampscript.xyz has an awesome article about it. I've used that multiple times as a template to build. It's a great thing. Like I highly recommend it. It's a stroke of genius the way he built that out.
Well, that one generates dummy data, right?
It does both. It builds the data extension and then creates the data inside of it.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. But I mean, just building the data extension itself for sure, but adding that extra part with the dummy data, that's pretty cool.
And could one of our panelists maybe add in the URL to that question so that they have it while we continue, please? And then can you compare SSJS to GTL, Guided Template Language? Whatever it stands for anymore, I mess it up every time.
My bias on this is going to shine through here. I honestly don't understand why guide template language even really exists. I can think of like one use case for it, and honestly, server-side JavaScript would do a passable job of it anyway. Like it seems like it's, and like I said, this is my bias. Like there's plenty of people I know that actually enjoy it, so it's not this is the gospel. The gospel by Greg. No, but I would say in 9.9 out of 10 instances, just use server-side JavaScript to parse it. Like there's really not much use of it for GTL.
And I do shy away from it just because like not a lot of people use it. And so if I was gonna be all gung-ho about it and like learn GTL to do some project, then that means that anyone who would have to come into that project after me would also need to learn it. And it's just not, when we're logging hours and recording all our time, that's sometimes not the best use of time.
Yeah,
when
exactly.
we already have a tool to use it, or to accomplish it, server-side JavaScript.
Yep, learn a language for one use.
Yep, right. All right, can I set a page status code to be different than 200 with SSJS?
I think this goes back to the other, like it's when you're looking at status codes and things like that, that's more of done outside of our purview. It's handled by the actual server itself. It's not something we can really touch, but through different headers and cookies and stuff, like you can send stuff along with it to be able to customize the different responses. But yeah, the status code is going to be what the status code be.
Yeah. Also, if we're talking about some sort of like, form submit that you do API calls and get those statuses back and serve up like an error page or a success page. I've done it where I get the different responses and then I check to make sure that they're all like okay, and then I kind of make my own variable, like either success or error. So it's not exactly like just changing the status codes, but it's kind of looking at what happened with the status codes and kind of coalescing those into your own variable status to figure out what to serve up.
Great. Can you update Salesforce objects using SSJS?
So
No, go ahead.
you can use server-side JavaScript to get your data out of the form elements and things like that if you're doing a cloud page or landing page. But the AMP script functions are really all that's available to update those objects. There's create, update, and retrieve. And I've done it in the past by using I think it was either a join or split function, and I had to match the syntax of what the expected string in the AMP script function would be, and then I did that with server-side JavaScript, and then I'd pass that value to the AMP script, and it would just already match the format that it was expected. So that's kind of my trick in doing that. What I found useful. I know a lot of other people have done their own. The main thing is that I've seen at least is executing it in JavaScript. You would use a treat as content area function and actually call that AMP script variable in that server-side JavaScript treat as content function, and that would actually execute the AMP script call. So it's you can use server-side JavaScript to do it, but technically you're using AMP script to actually create, update, and retrieve the objects.
Yeah, this is definitely the one part of server-side JavaScript that there is no parity with the AMP script capabilities. I'm pushing to Salesforce about that to try and match it, but again, it's not currently on the radar as far as I know, but there is interest. It's the best I got.
Can you give some use cases for the SSJS RaiseError function?
I'm not sure that not sure I've ever used that.
I would say that the use cases are similar to the AMP script use cases, but with try-catch, with all the different handling capabilities it has, honestly, I would say RaiseError isn't nearly as useful inside of server-side JavaScript as it is inside of AMP script, because if the try-catch fails, you can then change it to a different way so that the page doesn't have to error. You can give a custom handling of it that you can't really do in AMP script. So it's useful, but I don't think I can't really think of a great use case on it, because you can better do it in other functions.
Great. Could you two speak about using SSJS with SQL, as in, for example, looping through a job ID in SQL and getting data into a data extension?
Not sure I completely understand that question. I'm sorry.
How about just in general getting SSJS and SQL to play nicely together?
I would recommend
for a job ID. There we go. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
So to get, say, you had a list of job IDs and you wanted to use server-side JavaScript, and I'm reiterating what you're saying just to make sure I understand the question. So I apologize to say the same exact thing. But there's, say, an array of job IDs, and you want to loop through and use SQL to collect all of this send information from each of those and push it into different data extensions. What you can do is you can then have the server-side JavaScript use the core functions for queries to have that query first run on the first job ID, and then have it down where you edit the queries, where you change the target data extension, you change the code to actually utilize the new job ID, the second one in the array, and so on through the iterations, and just have it then run again. And then once that's done, you start the loop over again and update the query and run it, and just like that's probably your best utilization to be able to get that to dynamically grab all of those. I hope that answers the question. I'm still not 100% sure on it.
Yeah, if I was looking for information on a list of job IDs like that, I would honestly probably just use SQL and look at the job data view. But if there was, if you were trying to build out dynamic queries and stuff like that, that's where I would agree with Greg. And but yeah, I'd say that kind of gets into the use case of SQL versus JavaScript, and I'd probably stick with SQL for something like that.
Great. And so our last question will be, it's kind of a follow-up to the Salesforce object with AMP Script. How would you get JavaScript and AMP Script to play nicely together if you did want to use JSS or proxy, and then update the Salesforce object with AMP Script?
So I'm going to put the caveat out there, which I mean, this is a perfect use case of when it's necessary, but in general, I would never look to combine both of them. I'd avoid it as much as possible because the added processing time by having it to need to translate and then process each different language and then translate and process all of the results together to actually make them function is adding a ton of extra effort and time to your scripts or emails or whatever you're working in. As far as this, I think probably the most elegant way that I've seen is actually what Jacob was just describing with using the treatise content around the AMP script built out as a string inside of it, so that will then run the AMP script inside a server-side JavaScript, and you can then utilize that however you need to use. Other than that, like there's a lot of closing the script tag, passing the variables through the server-side JavaScript variable object to AMP script, and then having AMP script run, and then having the script for server-side JavaScript open up again, and then grab that returned variable to then run in server-side JavaScript. So like it's not pretty. No matter what you do, like I said, the treatise content is probably the most elegant solution I've seen around that.
And I've actually like pushed the necessary elements like into an array, and then use the split function with a comma, and that will build out because when you look at the syntax needed for like a create Salesforce object function, you can pass your like the ID that you're matching on, but then like all of the key value pairs, the field pairs, key value, that can just be an array that is split with a comma, and then using the variable dot get value or set value just to communicate with AMP script and JavaScript. That's how I've done it in the past. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you so much. And as a reminder, we will be sharing some of these links and the recording probably tomorrow or later this week. Give us a little bit of time to get it all converted and compiled and whatnot. And I'm going to hand it over to Gilda to close us out. Okay, maybe not. So thank you everyone for coming. Now I wish I knew what the next topic was. Do either of you know by chance? So you can join us here in a couple of weeks for our next topic. I know we have an AMP script event coming up with Jenna and Susanna that if you're a beginner for AMP script, you can keep an eye out for that. And then we will have our next monthly meetup in July as well for the technical developer community.
Yeah, I'm trying to look. I think next technical marketing is SMS, but I can't find the next lookup answers.
This is Gilda. Sorry, my phone was on mute. But no, thank you everyone for joining us. We will definitely send the recording to the webinar and the documents. Next week we have an awesome session on AMP script basics, and then on June 25th, we're going to have a technical deep dive into SMS, another amazing topic that I know a lot of us have an interest in learning about. But all of this information will be part of the follow-up email. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. We really appreciate you all taking the time to join us today. And thank you to Greg, Jacob, and Corinna for being awesome panelists today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.